If you know someone who would love a peek behind the galley curtain and find out what crew really get up to, please make sure to share the Red Eye podcast. Today's story was donated by someone who wanted to share what happened to them on a flight for two very different reasons. Firstly, because of the event itself. But secondly, and perhaps more poignantly, because of how it was handled by their company. To be honest, it's a common theme when we crew talk among ourselves, the feeling that we're just a number to our airline. That when it really matters, we can feel that we aren't seen or cared for on a personal level, outside of the aircraft at least. I mean, yeah, most companies try, and they don't always get it wrong. And in fact, in their defence, some of them do get it right a lot of the time. And yes, in many ways, things have improved in recent years, particularly when it comes to mental health awareness and support. But when an airline has tens of thousands of employees, we must accept that it's a near impossible task to make sure everyone feels genuinely valued all of the time. Some of us just accept that reality. We lean into the idea that if we're just a number, then we'll behave like one. We detach, we put our heads down, we get the job done and enjoy it for what it is. But that doesn't mean that when the crap hits the fan, we don't still need the kind of support you might expect from a smaller company. A personal touch and a human response. And honestly, just a little bit of respect. And when that's missing, it can really hurt. For today's contributor, the absence of that care ultimately led him to walking away from a job he once loved. And we think that's a crying shame. For him, for the passengers he would have looked after, and for the company that lost somebody great.
Doors to armed and cross-check.
Come fly the red eye.
Welcome aboard the Red Eye.
London to New York, 2020. Ben had known, even as he went to bed the night before with standby looming in the morning, that he'd end up at JFK. It was practically his second home. He bid for it, swapped onto it, and now, it seemed, he got called out for it too. "Sorry I'm late, I got called off standby," he said as he walked into the briefing room 10 minutes after it had started, offering the kind of apology that didn't ask for forgiveness and taking the only spare seat near the front. The truth was, he'd arrived half an hour earlier and could easily have made the start of the briefing. But ever since his dad died a couple of years back, and the airline had responded with what felt like cold formality and little care, Ben had accepted that he was just a number. And that was fine with him, as long as it worked both ways. So, instead of racing in to show extra effort, he'd used the last 30 minutes of his call-out window to get a double-shot iced macchiato from the coffee shop instead. And he'd drunk it there too. The manager glanced over the paperwork she was holding and gave him a brief nod. "I've put you in first with me," she said, her voice husky from years of cigarettes and whiskey, before returning to whatever she'd been saying before he arrived. He hadn't recognised the name on the crew list that morning, but now that he saw her and heard her, it clicked. Becal Barbie, one of the Jurassics. She'd been flying since the dawn of time, and with that aged glamour and bone-dry humour, that made her unforgettable. She was famous for her endless stories about the days she flew for long-defunct British Caledonian, so much so that everyone just called her Becal Barbie. Her real name was Patricia, but like most things in this job, it didn't need to make sense. Ben glanced around the room and caught the eyes of a couple of familiar faces. Crew he'd once shared rooftop cocktails with in New York. The kind of people that you could laugh with at 40,000 feet or 3 a.m. at a dive bar in Manhattan. Yeah, he thought, this was going to be a good trip. And it was. It was the flight home that was going to be the problem. New York to London the following evening. "I bet this tastes like shit," Ben muttered, holding up the bottle of English sparkling wine and scrutinising the label like it had personally offended him. It was a new addition to first class, part of some ill-conceived push for local sourcing, and someone in the cabin, against all odds, had actually ordered it. Barbie gave it a sideways glance as she cleared the galley side. The first service was done. The lights in the cabin now dimmed, and down the back the other cabins were just wrapping up. "I'll go give them a hand in business," Ben said, already loosening his tie. It was a short flight home tonight, just over 6 hours, and if they were going to squeeze in anything resembling a break, everything needed to be done quickly. He wasn't gone long. When he returned, B-Cow Barbie was leaning against the galley, thumbing through a glossy magazine like it was 1998. "You were right," she said, not looking up. Ben frowned. "About what?" She flicked her eyes toward an empty glass on the counter next to a half-empty bottle. "That sparkling wine. Tastes like shit." Then, as if nothing had been said, she looked back down at the magazine and turned the page with deliberate slowness. Ben blinked. Was she telling him that she'd had a glass of wine while on duty? He looked at the glass, then at her. Why was he even surprised? Barbie was a law unto herself. Old school to the bone. And anyway, she hadn't technically said she'd drunk it, so who was he to do anything about it? He pulled out a tray of Alfredo mozzarella balls, ignoring her sideways glance. No, they weren't supposed to eat first-class meals, but if she was drinking the wine, Ben figured, then I'm having the damn cheese balls. He chuckled to himself as she drifted out of the galley. Sometimes he wished he'd flown back when she did, back in the days when rules were more of a suggestion. He had barely sat down and picked up his cutlery when the curtain whooshed open and a woman rushed in wide-eyed. "I'm looking for the manager," she said, breathlessly. Ben froze with his fork mid-air. I think she just went down the back. There's a man. He's collapsed. They need help in the aisle." Ben sighed through his nose, casting one last look at his untouched meal, inhaling one last smell of melted mozzarella and Alfredo sauce. He set the tray aside and stood. "Coming," he said, stepping into the cabin behind her. The lighting in business was low, the quiet hum of the aircraft the only sound. At L2, in the space between the galley carts and the bulkhead, a large man was laid face up on the floor. At one end, a crew member was fitting an oxygen mask over his face. At the other end, another girl had his legs raised, steady hands bracing his ankles. From the looks of it, it was a simple faint. Probably low blood pressure, maybe dehydration. Ben crouched beside him, scanning the man's face, noting how pale he was, recognizing him from when he'd boarded. "Is he travelling with anyone?" he said, trying to remember. "I think they're around row 30, one of the girls said. "This side." "I'll go and let them know." Ben stood and stepped over them into the aisle, making his way down. In 30B and C, a lady and her grown-up son sat side by side, quietly watching their TV screens, completely unaware of what was unfolding a few rows away. Ben cleared his throat, preparing his voice to keep it measured. They looked up at him, and he could see the worry in their eyes as he told them what was happening. "Please don't worry. He's in good hands, and I'm sure it's just a faint," he assured them. "We get this all the time," he said, adding, "I'll come back and let you know what's happening in a minute." With that, he returned to the door, where the crew member on the floor nearest to him met his eyes. And without a word being exchanged, he knew that in the 2 minutes since he'd been gone, things had definitely changed for the worst. "We need the defib," she said urgently. The tension snapped tight in Ben's chest, and all thoughts of getting back to his Alfredo mozzarella balls evaporated. He ran to the next door, climbing into the medical cupboard to get everything out that he needed. Defibrillator, mask, medical kit. Laden with equipment, he arrived back, expecting the scene to have evolved. But nothing had changed, and it seemed that no one had taken charge. "Ben, can you do compressions?" one of the girls said, with fear in her voice. Ben laid down the equipment. They were all trained the same. They all knew what to do, but he could see that both of the girls were out of their depth. Both fairly new. They were looking to him to lead. And meanwhile, the real manager was nowhere to be seen. "Just a sec," he said, sidestepping and pulling the handset out of its cradle, making a PA for her. She may have snuck off. She may be having a whiskey in the toilet for all he knew, but whilst he might have been one of the most senior crew on tonight's flight, this wasn't all his responsibility. And he couldn't do it alone. With that, he straddled the man on the floor, his knees only just fitting either side. He pulled off his shoes to make more room for his feet, put his hands one on top of each other, locked his elbows, and pushed down. The sound sent a chill through his entire body. He had only heard anything like that when he'd once butterflied a chicken. The sound of a sternum cracking, breaking underneath him. He hesitated before carrying on, knowing that the trainers had prepared them for this on their medical training. But how could you ever be prepared for reality when the rubber doll you practiced on didn't crack like that? Hadn't wedged itself into a tight space, didn't have a face that you could remember looking at you with life in its eyes just a few hours ago. Nothing. And no amount of training could have prepared him for the reality. The man from 30A never made it. His soul left his body at 03:15 hours, 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, and there was nothing that Ben or his crew could have done to stop it. They fought for him for almost 45 minutes. Ben, shoeless and sweating as they moved around, administering shocks in a cycle of compressions and analysing. The heart surgeon and nurse who had come to help hadn't even been able to stop it. While the machine prompted them to push harder, they each used the last of their strength, going harder and deeper into his chest. "We can stop now." Barbie, who'd been found in the back galley having a cup of tea and a biscuit, said as she hung up her call to Medlink. Ben slumped backwards against the bulkhead, his ears ringing and his pulse thumping. The three crew who'd been delivering the CPR all sat in silence while they recouped. And then they had to move him. At the captain's insistence that he must be in a seat for landing, 4 crew heaved all 25 stone of the poor man into the aisle and attempted to lift him into a business class seat. Weak from the compressions, Ben hooked his arm under his armpit and hauled up, but even between them, the dead weight was literally that, and he reeled at the indignity on his behalf as they fought with his limbs, trying and failing to get him high enough. Eventually, admitting defeat, they pulled him back up the aisle and back into the same space as they'd just tried to save him in. They covered him with a blanket, and with 1 crew member assigned to watch over, the family being consoled nearby, the sun rose on a new day that he wasn't going to see. And Ben, unable to retrieve his shoes from behind him, returned to the first-class cabin to deliver the breakfast service. As if all of that had just happened in some parallel universe where he'd accidentally left his shoes behind. The ACAST message that had come through before landing hadn't bothered him too much. Ben wasn't surprised that no managers were available to meet the aircraft, and that he and the others were expected to go all the way back to check-in after landing for a debrief so that whoever was on duty could tick the box. It didn't surprise him at all. He had long since stopped being disappointed by this company. These days he even embraced just being a number, never feeling bad if he called in sick. Playing the game back on them always felt good, but now that they were on the ground, the buffoon of a captain was really getting his goat, and he could feel the heat rising under his collar. In the galley, the paramedics had stripped the man down and were doing whatever they needed to do. The police had examined his body, asking questions about the injuries to his chest. They were only doing their job. Ben knew that. But he couldn't help feeling like he was being interrogated when they'd asked if they had taken anything from the body. And even worse, why he had so much bruising. Because I had to compress it so hard, I broke his effing sternum in order to restart his heart. He'd wanted to spit, but he was saved by one of the others explaining first. Then there was the turnaround guy, asking how long they were going to take because the plane needed to get back to New York. And now the grey-haired sky god had come out of his cockpit and was blustering about how one of his 10 exits was blocked, how they should have tried harder to get him into a seat. It was too much. And his voice was nothing more than white noise to Ben. Just a buzzing sound as his lips moved, and he didn't even bother to answer. He hadn't even been down here. He hadn't seen how hard they had worked to save this man's life. He had no idea of how exhausted they were, or how hard they had tried to lift him into a business-class suite like he had told them to do. He didn't even know that they had dropped the poor man. Something that would stay with Ben for months later. He just didn't know. And yet here he was, spouting about stuff that really did not matter. In an emergency, they had 9 other exits. In an emergency, they'd have opened that door and sent the poor man out first if they'd needed to. But this had been their emergency. This was the one they had been living while he'd sat with his stripes on the cockpit, thinking that he had a clue. The white noise was still there in the check-in centre as the manager ticked his boxes. And Ben climbed into his car later with a strange numbness about him. Stuck somewhere in between the 2 universes that he had just been in. Three days later.
Hi, Ben, it's Miles from management. I'm just checking in.
Ben bristled. He'd been expecting the call. It was the same script they used when his dad had died, thinly veiled concern marking a single goal, to find out when he'd be back at work. And Miles didn't disappoint.
I just wanted to see how you're doing. How have you been?
Okay, thanks, Ben said flatly. Years ago, he might have made an effort, shared how he felt, maybe even believed that they cared. But now he knew better. This wasn't about him. It never was. Miles was just circling, softening the edges before landing the real question.
Oh, okay, that's great. So, do you think you'll be fine for your next duty?
A small smile pulled at Ben's lips. Classic. The last 3 days had been a blur of emotion as he had processed what had happened, trying to make sense of it, rewinding and replaying every moment of that flight like it might suddenly make a difference. And while on the surface he was okay, and in many ways he would be, he wasn't quite ready to find out how he'd feel stepping back onto an aircraft. Not yet. Not like this. And not on a one-night Seattle with no crew rest. Make it a 5-night Maldives and maybe he'd have considered it. No, sorry, Miles, I'm not up to my next duty, I'm afraid. There was a pause on the line.
So, you're refusing your next duty?
Ben shook his head. Nothing surprised him anymore. No, Miles, I'm not refusing it. I'm telling you, I need a bit more time to work through what happened. It was only a small win, a fleeting moment of power. Power over Miles, over the company, even over the chaos of that night. But it didn't last. When Ben returned to work a few weeks later, by a bizarre, unfortunate coincidence, he found himself on the exact same flight to New York, the same flight number, same route, and even the same aircraft. He made his way to work, getting more and more anxious as the airport got closer, feeling less and less unsure if he could actually do it. And when he got there, against his instincts, he approached the manager at the desk. "I don't mind doing the same flight," he said, "if it's on a different plane. But I can't do both." The manager listened. He nodded politely, even offered a few sympathetic words. And then he put the final straw on this camel's back. He gave him 2 options: do the flight or call in sick. But he wasn't sick. He was just asking for help. And it seemed that in this company, to Ben at least, that simply wasn't something they offered. Over the next few months, Ben struggled with his mental health, with sleep, with panic that hit out of nowhere mid-flight. But most of all, he struggled to show up for a company that couldn't show up for him. So he left. A great crew member, one who had given over a decade of service, walked away because they couldn't do for him what he had done for their passengers. What he had done for 30A. They couldn't care. But before he left, he made sure his voice was heard. He gave the company his suggestions, told them honestly how they had made him feel, and outlined what they could have done better. And hats off to them, word has it that some of what he said stuck. They took parts of it on board, updated procedures, and even amended the manual to allow for a single exit to be blocked in the event of a death on board. He left a legacy. And while he's no longer flying with that airline, a small part of him still is, etched into the pages of the very manual he once had to follow. We wanted to do this episode because whilst I love to talk about my great memories of flying, and we get funny stories and heartbreaking stories from people who are still in the air, the industry is a bit broken. I mean, whilst I started flying well over 20 years ago, it was still quite individual. People were encouraged to use their own flair and their personality to give the passengers the best possible time and make it an experience. The companies now seem almost too big. I feel like they're run by accountants that only care about the bottom line and not actually about the experience of not just their customers, but their employees too. Richard Branson famously says if you treat your employees well, then they'll treat your customers well. But I'm not sure that applies to any airline nowadays. Recently, there have been strikes in Canada due to the fact that the crew aren't even paid unless the airplane door is closed. So all of that pre-flight checks, the safety stuff, the welcoming the passengers on board, all of that isn't paid for. It's crazy. And the crew members, they just feel like a number. And when you treat your employees like that, how do you expect them to treat your customers well? Most airlines use their crew as a selling point. You're going to get cared for by the most wonderful people in the industry. And the crew want to do that. I know when I first started out, I reveled in the fact that I could make every single passenger's experience individual. I'd talk to them, find out where they were going, hear their story, and then try and tailor my service to give them the best possible experience. Towards the end of my days, I just felt like that wasn't what I wanted to do anymore because I didn't feel like anybody really cared about me. They didn't care about whether I was happy. They didn't care about whether I was looked after. They didn't care about whether I was healthy enough to fly because I was so tired from the short layovers and the increased workload as they got rid of crew members on flights. We know that big companies do struggle to get it right. It's an industry-wide problem. And with the bigger airlines, we are just a number. And to some extent, so are the people in the office. I mean, they've got boxes to tick and a hierarchy to report to as well. And some seem to struggle with putting themselves in our shoes. In many ways, we make it work for us. But sometimes, when we need a bit more support, it can be quite hard to find. There are definitely things improving. And this story happened a few years ago. There's been great steps forward in support and in mental health especially. Perhaps if it had been in place more back then, though, people like Ben and myself wouldn't have left a great career to find the peace that we needed. Have you ever had an experience like this? If you have, I'd love to hear your story. And if you're a passenger, I'd love you to just think about our crew as more than just a number, but as a human being who is there to give you an amazing start to your journey, but also somebody who might be there for you in your worst times as well. Thanks for listening.
The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you.
Our author, Kaylee Kay, does an incredible job of taking these true stories and turning them into fun little episodes for the Red Eye podcast. But did you know she's already written 6 novels, and they are amazing? So if you want to read those, visit Amazon and search for Kaylee Kay, and I'll put a link in the show notes too.